Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hitz.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. As many of you probably know, there's a mutual fascination between St. John's College and Thomas Aquinas College, the two colleges in the world where we read Apollonius of Perga and love him as he should be loved. Our wonderful dean didn't mention that MC Hammer and I bonded over regenerating flatworms. That was what made him take it. We were on Twitter looking at videos of regenerating flatworms, and that was when he decided to listen to my book. So you never know what depths people hide. So the talk I'm going to give tonight is really a bit of a roundabout way of posing a question. So I'm going to be concluding with a question, and I'm hoping that that's sufficiently enough of an affinity between St. John's and Thomas Aquinas that you two are also interested in questions. The question that I want to ask is about the topics about what the life of the mind is. The thing I'm particularly curious and puzzled about is how the life of the mind is transferred from person to person, how it passes from person to person. In other words, how teaching and learning work. And I think I have some pieces of a puzzle, and I'm going to travel in a way that might feel roundabout in the way that I normally do, drawing on the texts that we have in common and drawing on some other things, in an attempt to try to really drill down into this question about how the life of a mind, which is a way of a mode of activity, a mode of life, a way of being a living being, how that can be passed from one person to another, especially in the form of teaching and learning. And I think, anyway, I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it in the question period. So let me begin with a moment in Augustine's Confessions that I find particularly enchanting and fascinating. I don't remember actually which, I think it's about book 4 or something like that. You will know better than I do, but at the time at the place where this passage is, he's a successful teacher of rhetoric in Milan. He's breaking, or he's already broken with the Manichaeans. He's just at the border of the break with the Manichaeans. That's the Gnostic cult he's spent many years with, studying and teaching. He's overwhelmed by the limits of human understanding and skeptical that anyone could come to know the truth about how to live. So he oscillates back and forth at this part of the narrative between skepticism that anything certain can be known and his budding interest in the Catholic faith. And the latter is nurtured, of course, by his hearing the preaching of Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. So here's how he describes a dialogue he has with himself at this time. Tomorrow I shall find it. See, it will be perfectly clear, and I shall have no more doubts. Faustus, this is the great Manichaean intellectual, he'll come and explain everything. What great men the academic skeptic philosophers were. So he's just suddenly switched from thinking that Faustus is going to come to explain everything to thinking that the skeptics were great people who deny there's any such thing as knowledge. So he says, nothing for the conduct of life can be a matter of assured knowledge. And he switches modes again. Yet let us seek more diligently and not lose heart. The books of the church we know not to contain absurdities. The things which seemed absurd can be seen in another way which is edifying. Let me fix my feet on that step where as a boy I was placed by my parents until clear truth may be found. So he's just oscillated between 3 points in less than 30 seconds, okay? And then he asks himself, but where can truth be sought? When can it be sought? Ambrose has no time. There is no time for reading. Where shall we look for the books that we need? Where and when can we obtain them? From whom can we borrow them? Fixed times must be kept free hours appointed for the health of the soul. Great hope has been aroused. Why do we hesitate to knock at the door, which opens the way to all the rest? Well, our pupils occupy the mornings. What should we do with the remaining hours? Why do we not investigate our problem? But then when should we go to pay respects to our more influential friends, whose patronage we need? When are we to prepare for what our students are paying for? When are we to refresh ourselves by allowing the mind to relax from the tension of anxieties? So Augustine's language can be lofty, can be remote, can be theologically sophisticated, but this, I think, is a very human moment. He wants to know how to live. He really does. He's not worried, really he's not. He's not worried about discovering a truth that might spoil his career or require him to leave his concubine. He just doesn't have time. He's too busy. Between his students and his patrons, also Ambrose doesn't have any time. He's too busy, everyone's too busy, he doesn't have time to read. Besides, he doesn't have time to get the books. Too bad for Augustine. He doesn't have time to figure out the best way to live. He's too busy. Earlier in the same section of the Confessions, Augustine describes how busy Ambrose is. Now, Ambrose is busy, and I hope you'll permit me a little bit of historicizing. I'm going to give you a source, so don't get mad. Okay, it turns out that bishops at that time, and I'm following the account in Peter Brown's biography of Augustine, which I recommend after you graduate highly. It's wonderful. Anyway, bishops at that time were expected to adjudicate disputes between members of the flock, so endless demands on their time. The life of a bishop is so hectic that on Brown's account, after Augustine has fully become Catholic, he'll do anything to avoid becoming a bishop. So Brown describes him going from town to town in Africa, avoiding carefully any occasion where he might be appointed bishop by acclamation, which is how it's done at that time. Alas, and he's tricked in the end. So he goes to a liturgy in Hippo that he thinks is for something else, and it turns out to be his own ordination as a bishop. And tears, Count Brown is wonderful, tears pour down his face because his life of philosophical leisure is over. Okay, so back to Ambrose and Augustine. So Augustine, at this time, when he's caught between various motivations and holding himself too busy to really think seriously about things, he describes with reverence what Ambrose does in the short moments in which he does not have an appointment. Ambrose reads silently. He doesn't restrict access to visitors. He just sits and reads, passing his eyes over the page. So Augustine says, "I could not ask what I wished as I wished, for I was kept from face-to-face conversation with him, but the throng of men with their own troubles, whose infirmities he served. The very little time he was not with these, he was refreshing either his body with necessary food or his mind with reading." And here's the picture of him reading. When he read, his eyes traveled across the page, and his heart sought into the sense, but voice and tongue were silent. No one was forbidden to approach him, nor was it his custom to require that visitors should be announced. But when we came into him, we often saw him reading, and always to himself. After that, we had sat for a long while in silence, unwilling to interrupt a work on which he was so intent. We would depart again. So Ambrose has chosen to use these spare snatches of time to return within himself, to become a kind of an island of stillness. His reading, it seems, is almost a type of prayer, and it's certainly an example of what we might call leisure. And I know that here at Thomas Aquinas College, you all know perfectly well what leisure is. So I don't need to lecture you about it as I might other college students. You know that it isn't a break from real life. It's not a vacation. It's not time at the beach where you rest and restore yourself in order to go back to work. Leisure is a state that looks like the culmination of a life, and we can expect it, following the tradition, to have a contemplative character. But I think that these words and phrases, like any others, can become stale and dry. They can be formulations we exchange without understanding. And this lecture is an attempt to remind us, including myself, of what kind of thing contemplative leisure really is, and so to approach the question of what the life of the mind really is, and again, to raise the question of how it's passed on. So to go down a little further in this same direction, we have these lovely pair of images that I want you to keep in mind of Augustine running around like a chicken with his head cut off, unable to focus on the question that matters most. And Ambrose, with demands coming at him from all sides, able to find in just any spare moment the ability to focus, to concentrate, to return within himself, and to think, and to do the thing that presumably he always wants to be doing. So what does this life of the mind, this contemplative leisure, look like in real life, in other contexts? So we have this one central example, and I've collected over the years parallels for a variety of eclectic sources. I know someone will ask me about the eclectic sources, but I don't want to take away your thunder. So consider first, you can think about how you're going to ask me about it. Renée is the heroine of a French art house film called The Hedgehog, released in 2009. She's the concierge of a wealthy apartment building in Paris. She wears slouchy cardigans, she's middle-aged, she's childless, she's a widow, so she's not your normal cinematic heroine. Her work is humble, cleaning, taking mails, organizing the workmen. But we learn in the film that her real life is elsewhere. She has a hidden room behind her kitchen where she reads philosophy, literature, and the classics. Her secret life attracts two other disaffected members, residents of the building, a Japanese suitor named Kakuro, who recognizes her because her cat is named for Leo Tolstoy, as are his cats. Okay, it's cute. Also, the protagonist of the film, Paloma, who's a 14-year-old girl who's so disaffected from the superficiality of her surroundings that she's contemplating suicide. And it has to be a French art house film for a comic, lighthearted film to be about a teenager who's thinking about committing suicide. You have to take it with a grain of salt. Or watch more French art house films to get what the vibe might be. So these two people, Paloma realizes that Renée is a kindred spirit when she discovers a philosophical treatise left on the dinner table, and she notices sitting there a closed door to the reading chamber and says, "What's behind that door?" So she's drawn to this person by her secret inner life, her life of contemplation, reading, and leisure. So this strange little French art house film, made not that long ago, suggests a sort of what I'd call a back-of-the-envelope picture of the life of the mind. So just some basic principles to write down and think about and examine and see how they hold up. First of all, the life of the mind is a form of the inner life of a person. It's a place of retreat or reflection. As such, it is withdrawn from the world, and the world means what it means, I think, originally in the dialogues of Plato, the digression to the Theaetetus, for instance, but also most especially in the Gospel of John and the Christian tradition. The world is the locus of competition and struggle for wealth, power, prestige, and status. So it's a form of inner life, it's withdrawn from the world. It's a source of dignity, which is obvious in this case and striking because of Renée's low status, a childless widow of middle age in a working class profession. Thirdly is dignity. Fourthly, counting becomes more difficult. We're not good at counting at St. John's. You guys probably are here. Okay. Fourthly, it opens space for communion. That is, the life of the mind allows for profound connections between human beings. So Renée's closet life, her withdrawn life, where she finds her dignity, where she recovers it from the crushes and blows of ordinary life. It's also the place where her deepest friendships are formed, where these other people are attracted to meet her. So I want to illustrate this back-of-the-envelope view with further images that will be more familiar. So the Socrates of Plato's Republic acknowledges the likelihood of the world continuing in its evils, and he describes the philosopher as someone who retreats from public life, like someone who has taken refuge under a little wall from a storm or dust or hail driven by the wind. Socrates himself, of course, loses himself in thought at the threshold of a dinner party, as described in Plato's Symposium. So he's dressed to the nines, he's taken a bath, apparently for the first time, and he's standing at the threshold of this party, ready to go, and suddenly starts thinking about something. We also have reports of Thales, described both in Plato and in Aristotle, as having fallen into a well from looking at the stars. Or Diogenes the Cynic, whose only request to Alexander the Great upon meeting him was that he get out of his sunlight. Or Plutarch's wonderful account of the mathematician Archimedes. Do you read Archimedes here? Someone tell me. Okay, you do, I'm sure. Okay, no need to ask. It's pretty tough stuff, but okay. So in Plutarch's account, which is in the Life of Marcellus, Archimedes is described so taken up in a mathematical proof that he does not notice that his city is being taken by the Romans, and he's killed by a soldier when he insists on finishing his proof before being taken to the Roman authorities. Later writers gave him last words, "Don't disturb my circles." So ancient Christian accounts of intellectual life draw on this same ideal I would call Platonic. So Augustine, in a lovely passage in On Free Will, describes the love of wisdom as an effort to gather our whole soul somehow to that which we attain by the mind, to station ourselves and become wholly entrenched there, so that we may no longer rejoice in our own private goods, which are bound up in ephemeral things, but instead cast aside all attachment to times and places and apprehend that which is always one and the same. Now, for me, in a way, this example that is the most profound and that hits me most deeply and most repeatedly are the images from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance of Our Lady, of the Virgin Mary at the Annunciation. So this is when the angel arrives with his invitation to her to bear Christ. In these images, she's often reading, sometimes a small book that looks like a prayer book or a psalter, but sometimes huge stacks of books. So she's engaged in some quite serious work of some kind. Sometimes she's reading the passage in Isaiah, where it's prophesied that a virgin will conceive and give birth to the Messiah. In these images, she's always sheltered, always alone, and always set off from the outside world. The artists draw, of course, on the affinity between the intellectual and the spiritual lives. They draw attention to Mary as attentive to the garden enclosed, where the God of truth meets the believer, set apart from the demands of the world. So these images of Our Lady reading a book at the Annunciation have their origins in the fathers of the church, especially in Origen, who in his commentary on Luke sought to explain the difference between Mary's confident, faithful questioning of the angel and Zechariah's earlier mocking disbelief. The fathers insist that she would have known the prophecies of the Messiah through her reading and studying. Furthermore, it's evident to them that she would have all the virtues and that the virtue of wisdom required study. And Ambrose makes perhaps the earliest suggestion that Mary was reading at the Annunciation. So Ambrose reappears in our lecture from the beginning. This is Ambrose writing in his treatise on virginity. She, Mary, when the angel entered, was found at home in privacy without a companion, that no one might interrupt her attention or disturb her. and she did not desire any women as companions who had the companionship of good thoughts. Moreover, she seemed to herself to be less alone when she was alone. For how could she be alone, she who had with her so many books, so many archangels, so many prophets? So her reading symbolizes her wisdom, and so the freedom with which she consents to bear the Messiah. Her enclosed or sheltered surroundings represent the ascetic cost of that wisdom. That wisdom grows in silence, in solitude, in deprivation, and in sacrifice. So now I want to return to having spent a little dabbled for a second in the Christian heritage of these images. I want to return to more of how they surface in contemporary life. So Albert Einstein was a failure as a graduate student in physics and could not get an academic job. If you had grad students here, that would be very encouraging to them, but you don't have any here, so you have to tell your grad student friends that Albert Einstein didn't get a job. He found work as a patent clerk, and it was in his patent office in his spare time where he wrote the extraordinary papers on the photoelectric effect and Brownian movement that changed the face of the mathematical study of nature. Now, he called the patent office his worldly cloister where I hatched all my most beautiful ideas. Here's a different type of example. We're just going to keep throwing them at you. So the African-American activist Malcolm X entered prison as a man named Malcolm Little. He was a defiant hedonist, addicted to drugs, reliant on petty crime. Here I'm relying on the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is another wonderful book to read in the summer. Or on a weekend, I don't know. I don't know how much extra time you have to read, maybe not much. So his father had been murdered by white men when he was a child, and his family subsequently broken up by the local welfare office. Long studies in the prison library and conversations with a self-educated inmate changed him. Malcolm began to read first the dictionary, then books on etymology and linguistics. He studied Latin and German. He converted to Islam, a faith introduced to him by his brothers. He read the Bible, the Quran, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, and Kant, as well as works of Asian philosophy. He felt his old ways of thinking, in his words, disappear like snow off of a roof. He left prison as a minister in the Nation of Islam and a powerful spokesman for the African American communities that were most beaten down by poverty and violence that was fed by racial prejudice. So as the case of Malcolm X illustrates, intellectual life is not only a retreat or a refuge from difficult or dehumanizing realities. It's a source of transformation. And this, I think, echoes where we began in Augustine's Confessions, or is an echo of the ancient testimony of Augustine's Confessions. Augustine has the perfect life. He's a promising career, loving concubine, a son, the prospect of another wealthy wife to advance his prospects. You know, he belongs to the cult of the Manichaeans, which permits him this cosmic worldview that excuses him from any responsibility for his compulsions. He's schooled in this wonderful metaphysics that helps him to win tons of victories and arguments over ignorant Christians. So what happens to him? Well, he undergoes a course of serious reading in philosophy, which bores holes in his comfortable lifestyle, and it leads eventually to the collapse of the whole edifice. So as we all know, he converts to Christianity, he gives up both sex and his prestigious career, and he seeks out a life of philosophical retreat until it's wrecked in the way I described earlier. But he still wrote many books. I don't think it was wrecked completely. So the bookworm's escape, the thoughtful prisoner devouring the prison library, they evoke, I think, the Catholic and Orthodox contemplative traditions. The desert retreat, the platform on the pillar, the cell of the monk or the nun. The Christian versions of poverty, failure, and confinement have an ineluctably supernatural character. They depict the communion of the individual soul with the transcendent God who creates and redeems. But forms of asceticism are found in a broad swathe of global religious traditions with different theological premises. Asceticism as such has its basis in our human elements, in our human nature. It's necessity for humans for forms of discipline and sacrifice to cultivate what's best in us. And that's, I think, thanks to the corrosive impact of wealth and status on our motivations. So I think all of these characters in some way are in retreat from, again, the world, which is this locus of the competitive pursuit of wealth, status, and power. So dignity and community are by no means reserved to Einsteins or brilliant political figures or even to Roman Catholics. They are common human heritage. So just to review, our back-of-the-envelope features of the life of the mind feature a notion of withdrawal that's centrally important. The removal of the life of the mind from the world that accounts for its true inwardness, an inwardness distinct from the sort of obsessive, narcissistic inner tracking of one's social standing, sort of what I would describe as my inwardness as a teenager, but you guys were probably better teenagers. It is a withdrawn person's independence from contests over wealth or status that provides or reveals a dignity that can't be ranked or traded. And that dignity, along with the universality of the objects of the intellect, the fact that they're available to everyone, that's what opens up space for real communion. So that is my back-of-the-envelope sketch of the life of the mind. And in what remains, I'd like to begin to open up the question that I hope will guide our conversation in the question period. So I've told stories and described images. And images are, by definition, superficial. So I'd like to dig more deeply into what lies behind them. So I think one thing that emerges from a second round of reflection on the images and on the back of the envelope sketch is that our inner lives, following the paintings of Our Lady at the Annunciation, are gardens enclosed. And the word garden, I think, is significant. A garden is, after all, a living thing or a collection of living things. In other words, our inner lives are lives. They are sources of activity and growth. They have an inner source of motion and determination. Yet, the living mind in question requires pruning to thrive like a garden plant. So that's the role of withdrawal, asceticism, restraint, restriction, solitude, etc. It's to allow the life of the mind to grow in the proper way, just as you would have to weed your garden to get the plants to grow in the way that you would like. Yet, like any garden, its interior principle of growth means that there are limits on our capacity to control it. In fact, control is really hardly appropriate. Once pruned and watered, once the soil is checked, we wait for that life to show itself and to bear its fruits. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates tells a story of the invention of writing in Egypt. Its inventor, the god Tooth, claims that it will help people to remember. That is, writing will help people to remember. But the god serving as king, Thamus, objects. This invention of writing will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn by the neglect of their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters, which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have found a medicine not for memory, but for reminding. You furnish your students, this is where it starts to bite, about the invention of writing. You furnish your students with the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. for they will have heard many things without teaching, and will therefore seem to know a lot, despite being ignorant for the most part, and difficult to live with, since they are not wise, but only appear wise. It's such a nice dig. Plato's such a good writer, right? It's just thrown in there. And difficult to live with, by the way. So facts, which I think are the dominant medium in which what we judge knowledge is conveyed out in the world and in mainstream educational institutions. Facts, like writing, are knowledge in storage. They're desiccated understanding, stored up to be rehydrated or restored to life at a later time or place. They are stand-ins or representations for a living understanding, such as the active judgment of the living human being that originates it. Once put outside a person on ink on paper or in encoded pixels, the origin falls from view. As Socrates go on to say, the written sentence, which is like the disembodied record of the judgment, which might have been judged true or false, right? The fact. It's rolled around everywhere in Socrates' language, like flotsam and jetsam on the sea, able to be claimed by anyone, whether they have the understanding it represents or not. I have the passage there, but I think I better not read it. If people want to hear it in the question period, we can hear it then. So to me, the Phaedrus now strikes with particular power. I'm not sure there's any better description of the condition that we live in, not in these beautiful small liberal arts colleges, but in the broader world, that we swim in sentences without knowing who spoke them or why. Free-floating claims lodge in our minds like spores. We can repeat them as if we know and understand their origins in real thinking and judgment, but nothing will stop our mouths and prevent us if we do not. Their automatic authority, the authority given to them by the culture of the fact exchange, motivates us to cling to them when the going gets tough and when we fear diminishment or loss of status. Worse than that, again, in the broader outside world, in the darkness that surrounds us, our technological habits suggest that we believe that learning consists in the minimal acquisition of these dried up and dead judgments. To be used like directions from a GPS, one doesn't even have to learn the facts in question, but only to act on their assumption. Our thoughtless habits of deference and obedience to machines make it easy to forget, and now you'll start to see why I was talking about this whole time, I hope. Our thoughtless habits of deference and obedience to machines make it easy to forget that not only all true judgments, but all interesting judgments originate in a living activity. We make judgments when we get to know. That's the act of a mind. The act of a living mind is the making of a judgment. When we get to know a subject matter by reading, studying, and observation, by imagining and examining possibilities. If we do not cultivate these living activities of learning in ourselves or in others, we risk becoming circulators of dead sound and symbol, exposed to an endless and unresolvable struggle for power and status. That is, the realm of facts, the disembodied and desiccated judgments, which may have originated somewhere in a living act, circulate around unconnected from their sources. And they bear with them authority. They bear with them a demand for assent. And that bearing of authority is exploited by any power that seeks more power. So hence, the realm of the dead sound and symbol, the realm of the fact exchange, is the realm of the struggle for power and status. So I hope it gets even clearer. A statement of fact always represents a human judgment. It's easy for us to forget that. The fact about the weather is the judgment of a meteorologist or the experienced, observant layperson. The fact about a year in which the William of Conqueror invaded England is the judgment of a historian. The fact about what a Latin word means or what counts as a rule of Latin grammar is a judgment made by a philologist. The fact about how to get from Malibu to Ojai is the judgment of an experienced driver. So these judgments are processed and mediated by machines these days. They're not just imitations of human judgments, they actually rely on human judgments. They require real human judgments as inputs. Without human judgments as a basis, they produce, as we know, useless gibberish. So some judgments, now I'm trying to go in to explain why I think a fact bears authority, and then I'm going to make my way back to the things I began with at the beginning of the talk. Some judgments have a kind of immediacy and concreteness that bears truth with them. I open the drawer at my lab station, and I've just discovered one other note of affinity between Thomas Aquinas College and St. John's College, which is that we all have these clickers to light Bunsen burners that rarely work, and they're kept in drawers, and I think those build character. So here's a judgment that bears immediacy and concreteness. I open the drawer at my lab station, and there's a clicker. There's a clicker in this drawer, I proclaim. I know it's true, it's right before my eyes. If others gather around and doubt me, I can gesture towards it, showing that so that everyone can share my immediate, overwhelming experience of the truth of the fact that there is a clicker in the drawer. If others are not around, I may find myself alone with my fact, a fact that others may doubt or even scoff at. Oh, sure, I'm sure there's a clicker in the drawer. I bet there's little goblins there too, sure. So the example is very silly, but my intention's quite serious. The judgments that arise from our immediate experience are some of the most vivid that we have. And yet that vividness, the radiance of the truth of the judgment, is not always shareable with others. If I'm reporting on the contents of the lab drawer to anyone without access to the room, and there are hundreds, thousands, billions of people without access to our lab rooms, people who don't even know what one of these little clickers is. Can you imagine the ignorance? So those people must rely on some authority that's implicit in my report. So most things we call facts are not the objects of our immediate experience. Their truth is usually unavailable, and that is when we most especially in ordinary life use the word fact to communicate a claim to knowledge that is not shared by our audience. When we state facts, we hide the original judgment, whether ours or someone else's, under an air of authority. So a statement of fact in this general practice of the fact exchange, it's not universal, there are exceptions, but in general, it's a demand for agreement on a question when the ground or the basis or the evidence for the judgment is not available. Now, often I think that reliance of factual judgments on authority doesn't matter very much, and doesn't matter very much in practical contexts when the truth is going to come out quite quickly anyway. It's like, I think there's a clicker in that drawer, and you open it up and either it's there or it's not. It doesn't matter so much that you're relying on authority. But in daily conversation, in everyday writing, outside these little colleges, facts are not used in this simple practical way of there's a clicker in the drawer, there's colored chalk in the other room, I think you left your textbook in the cafeteria. But as a claim to authority on broader questions of human life, moral or political, or questions about the ways of nature. Okay. There's some other funny, entertaining things. I'm going to skip them because either I entertain you some more or I entertain you for too long. And I do actually want to get more closer to the substance of the talk. So consider, in our thinking about facts and judgments, the enunciations to the propositions of Euclid. For example, circles are to one another as the squares on their diameters. We spend as much time as it takes in class, I take it here as in St. John's, demonstrating the proofs that Euclid offers for these claims, sometimes offering alternate proofs, sometimes questioning the terms or the methods of the proof. We might describe this activity as the pursuit of truth so far as the objects are concerned. Yet I think we would not describe those enunciations, however luminously true and well justified, as facts in this other sense I've talked about. If I'm on the right track, the fact is not something true about the world. Those are truths that we don't tend to call facts. Sometimes we examine these truths, as we do with an enunciation from Euclid or Apollonius of Perga. Sometimes we take them for granted, but we're not necessarily calling them on them with a claim to authority. So if we think about our Euclid propositions, of course, what's presented in our classes as an invitation to examination, inquiry, study, or demonstration can be presented as a fact in another context, a fact in this derogatory sense. So there's a fact that many of us learned, for instance, in high school that underlies or connects with Euclid's famous proof about the relationship of the squares on the sides of right triangles. The fact has a pretentious title, the Pythagorean theorem. It's as if that told us anything about it, really. And has a snappy-sounding modernized formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. What's the relationship between the factual claim, used as a weapon by know-it-alls in schools around the world, and the piece of Euclid's writing that we discuss in class? Here's a simple answer. The know-it-all's fact is dead. Euclid's proposition, when a single person works through it or several of us together, is alive. It's more alive, I think, even than my vivid experience of the clicker in the lab drawer. Like all living things, it takes time to come to understand it, and new aspects of it emerge even over the course of years. So, a fact, when it's not simply a tool for establishing authority or jockeying for status, the way that a know-it-all might say, actually, a squared plus e equals c squared. It may point to something true or even deeply true, but it's been dried up like astronauts' ice cream, and it's traveled far away from its origins in a person's thinking and judgment, in the life of the mind, properly speaking. Of course, it's not quite right to call facts dead. What's dead remains so. In our study of Euclid, I think likely much of what you do here at the college as at ours, we enter into the living origins of dead facts. So we swim in a sort of mathematical flotsam and jetsam. There's various mathematical words and phrases that are tossed around at all times. But when we talk about them together, when we look at their foundations, you could say that we brought them back to life or we revivified them, except that has a kind of creepy resonance as if we were making zombies. The founding dean of St. John's followed Edmund Husserl in calling that process desedimentation, scraping off the deadening shell of the dried, empty words and phrases that we exchange, and seeing the truth of things as vividly as if it were before our own eyes. Now, how is learning transmitted? I'm getting there. Last part of the lecture. How is learning transmitted if it's not? So the notion of the fact exchange is an implicit, I think, I don't know how to put it. It's a convention that you accept automatically as a matter of course without thinking it through. There's an implicit account of the transmission of learning that's there, which is you tell someone a truth by giving them this verbal formulation that's been dried and desiccated as a matter of authority, and you give it to them for their assent. So how is learning transmitted if it's not transmitted by the verbal statement of fact demanding assent? So I snuck very sneakily into the lecture. Is that like a cognitive accusative or something? Someone should know what that is, but anyway. I snuck sneakily into the beginning of this lecture an implicit account, alternative account of the transmission of learning. It's clear that something happens to Augustine as he watches Ambrose reading. Not necessarily because he's reading what he's reading, but from him taking in the way that this person is living and responding to the world around him. He sees Ambrose reading almost in the way that we would see an image, the kinds of image that I've talked about earlier. He sees something, a way of being, which he does not have with his hectic, busy mind that jumps from one thing to another. Likewise, Malcolm X, the prisoner I mentioned earlier, he decides to start reading through a friendship with an inmate who reads and thinks and carries on intelligent conversations. He sees that, and he sees something that he doesn't have. And that changes something in the bottom of his heart and the bottom of his will that drives him towards a different way of doing things. So I think it's not a coincidence that these two examples of our many millions of examples are key examples of the transformative power of a certain image of the life of the mind. So these are two people whose lives were turned upside down by a life of reading and understanding and studying and thinking. So just as living and active human beings, so to speak, by their example, beget other living and active thinking. I'm giving an example and I stepped out of the example into the other thing. Okay, so just as living and active human beings, like our parents, beget other living and active human beings, ourselves, so thinking beings beget other thinking beings. They do this, I think, in more than one way. In one case, as we see with Augustine or Malcolm, the effect of a thinking human being is an engine of a type of conversion. It's an engine of transformation. It's transformative. And here the effect, I think, is a matter primarily of the heart or the will. That is, that image of thinking shapes and changes our deepest desires for ourselves, our fundamental motivations. And this is one of, I think, the great reason why so many of the great authors use images. What do we remember from Plato? We might remember the arguments, sure, there are many wonderful arguments, but we remember the cave, the ladder of love, the image of Socrates being killed for his beliefs. Those are the things which have set people's hearts aflame and turned them towards philosophy, as much as anything, I think, in the arguments. Yet in a way that I find even more mysterious and that I'm most puzzled by currently, which I mean to exploit this group of people to learn more about, a living mind, that is to say, a teacher, does not only strike our hearts, but passes on more concrete modes of understanding. Not in the mode of simply transmitting desiccated sentences which are to be absorbed and repeated on a kind of authority, but in a different way. So Socrates in Plato's Meno, he leads, you will all know this, I think, right? Yes, you do, okay. I'm just going to assume that you do. You should if you don't. Go home and read the Meno if you haven't. He can lead the slave boy through this geometry problem, through both the failure and then the solution, the question and then the solution, because he knows enough geometry to do so. So Socrates knows the answer to the question he's asking. And yet his teaching is he insists he's not teaching, but his interaction with the slave boy draws out something inside the slave boy himself, and I'm persuaded that he really does draw something out of what's inside the slave boy himself. So what's the relationship between the active knowledge of our teachers and the understanding that comes to life in us as we learn? This is the question that I would like to leave you with. Thank you so much for listening.